The bustling airport terminal was alive with the familiar hum of excitement and chaos. Passengers hurried to their gates, announcements echoed through the air, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the metallic tang of jet fuel. Among the crowd was Mr. James Cole, a reserved elderly black man dressed in a crisp navy blue suit. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his silver hair a testament to years of wisdom. To the untrained eye, he looked like just another traveler, perhaps a retired professor or a doting grandfather on his way to visit family. But appearances, as they often are, can be deceiving. James clutched his boarding pass tightly, glancing at the gate number on the overhead signs. Flight 241 to New York was about to board, and the long journey ahead didn't faze him. As he approached the gate, he offered a polite smile to the attendants, who barely acknowledged him. It wasn't the first time James had been overlooked, and he'd long since stopped letting it bother him. But today, something felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. As passengers began to queue for boarding, James took his place at the end of the line. Behind him, a young couple whispered animatedly, their excitement infectious. "I can't believe we're finally going to New York," the woman gushed. James smiled to himself, remembering a time when he, too, had marveled at the city's possibilities. Now New York was a second home, a place where deals were struck and empires were built. The flight attendants at the gate were busy scanning tickets and directing passengers. Among them was Sarah, a junior flight attendant with a sharp tongue and an even sharper attitude. Sarah was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and her tendency to let her frustrations show. As the line moved forward, James stepped up to the counter. He handed Sarah his boarding pass, his movements slow but deliberate. "Sir, can you step aside for a moment?" Sarah's tone was clipped, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the pass. James raised an eyebrow, but complied, stepping out of line as the other passengers continued to board. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. Sarah barely looked up. "Your seat assignment is unclear. Let me check with my supervisor." James nodded, his patience unwavering. He had experienced worse in his lifetime and wasn't about to let a minor inconvenience rattle him. But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah's tone grew sharper, her body language more dismissive. Passengers glanced over curiously, their faces a mix of sympathy and annoyance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah returned with a frown. "You're in first class?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "Yes, I am," James replied simply. Sarah's lips tightened, and for a moment, she seemed to weigh her options. "Well, we'll see about that," she muttered under her breath. She waved him through begrudgingly, her eyes rolling as he made his way down the jet bridge. Once aboard the plane, the tension only escalated. James found his seat near the window in the first-class cabin, his movements deliberate as he stowed his carry-on and settled in. He was looking forward to the flight, a chance to unwind and enjoy the luxuries of first class. But Sarah, it seemed, had other plans. She made her way down the aisle, her demeanor cool and professional to the other passengers. But when she reached James, her expression hardened. "Sir, you can't store your bag here. It needs to go in the overhead compartment," she snapped. James looked up, confused. "I believe it fits under the seat." "I said it needs to go overhead," Sarah insisted, her voice louder this time. A few passengers turned to watch the exchange, their curiosity piqued. "Of course," James said, keeping his tone even. He stood slowly, his joints protesting as he reached for his bag. The effort didn't go unnoticed by the nearby passengers, some of whom murmured amongst themselves. Sarah's behavior grew more hostile as the flight progressed. She ignored James when serving drinks, made snide remarks under her breath, and even went so far as to bump his seat accidentally during the service. James endured it all with quiet dignity, his patience seemingly endless, but the other passengers were less forgiving. Whispers spread throughout the cabin, questioning Sarah's unprofessionalism. Then came the moment that would change everything. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, Sarah approached James with an air of authority. "Sir, you need to move to economy. There's been a mistake with your ticket," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. James looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. "I believe I have the right to remain in my assigned seat." Sarah's patience snapped. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're causing a disruption in first class. If you don't move, I'll have to involve the captain." The cabin fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. James met Sarah's gaze, his voice steady as he said, "Ma'am, I assure you, I've done nothing to disrupt this flight." But Sarah wasn't listening. She raised her hand in frustration, her gesture more aggressive than she intended. The audible gasp from the passengers echoed through the cabin as her hand connected with James's shoulder in a sharp, dismissive shove. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Sarah's face went pale as she realized the gravity of her actions. The other passengers exchanged shocked looks, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. James sat back in his seat, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Sir, Sarah stammered, her confidence evaporating. James held up a hand to silence her. 7 minutes, he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "In 7 minutes, you'll understand the consequences of your actions." The cryptic statement hung in the air, its weight palpable. Sarah stepped back, her mind racing. The passengers leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Who was this man? What did he mean by 7 minutes? And what would happen next? As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin grew unbearable. The cabin was heavy with silence, save for the faint hum of the plane's engines. All eyes remained fixed on James, who now sat motionless, his calm demeanor at odds with the storm brewing around him. The tension was almost unbearable, a knot of unanswered questions twisting tighter with each passing second. Sarah hovered nearby, her confidence faltering as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She stole glances at James, trying to decipher his words, but his composed expression betrayed nothing. The other passengers whispered among themselves, their hushed voices carrying hints of curiosity and indignation. "Did you see that? She actually pushed him." One woman murmured to her seatmate. "Who does she think she is? He's just sitting there, minding his own business," came another reply. Meanwhile, James remained unbothered by the murmurs around him. His gaze was fixed out the window, the endless stretch of clouds below mirroring his thoughts. He'd lived long enough to recognize when someone's behavior stemmed from ignorance, and Sarah's actions were no exception. But he also knew when it was time to stand his ground. Sarah retreated to the galley, her hands trembling as she grabbed a water bottle. She took a long sip, trying to steady her nerves. Her colleague, a senior flight attendant named Melissa, noticed her unease and approached cautiously. "Sarah, what's going on out there?" Melissa asked, her voice low but firm. Sarah hesitated, debating whether to tell the truth. "It's nothing. Just a passenger in first class being difficult," she replied, avoiding Melissa's probing gaze. Melissa raised an eyebrow. "Difficult? Or are you overreacting again? You've been on edge all day." "I'm not overreacting," Sarah snapped, though her tone betrayed her guilt. He was causing a scene. Was he, though? Melissa's voice softened, but her eyes didn't waver. She knew Sarah had a tendency to let her temper get the best of her, and something about her story didn't sit right. Before Sarah could respond, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, and we're expecting a smooth ride for the next hour. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The captain's announcement did little to ease the tension in the first-class cabin. If anything, it served as a reminder of the confined space they all shared, now thick with unspoken accusations and unresolved tension. A few rows back, a middle-aged man in a business suit pulled out his phone, discreetly recording the scene. His eyes darted between James and Sarah, sensing there was more to the story than met the eye. "This is going viral," he muttered to himself, already crafting the perfect caption in his mind. James, oblivious to the camera pointed his way, finally turned his attention to the flight attendant standing near his seat. It wasn't Sarah this time, but Melissa. She approached cautiously, her demeanor professional yet warm. "Sir, I wanted to check in and see if there's anything I can do for you," Melissa said gently. James looked up, studying her for a moment before nodding. A glass of water would be appreciated. And perhaps, he paused, his gaze flickering toward the galley where Sarah lingered. A word with your captain when he has a moment. Melissa's eyebrows knitted together in concern, but she nodded. I'll see what I can do. She returned a few minutes later with the water, placing it on James's tray table with a small, apologetic smile. I'll let the captain know. As Melissa walked away, James took a sip of the water, his mind drifting to memories of his younger years. He hadn't always been the composed man sitting in that seat. Once, he'd been fiery and impatient, quick to respond to slights with equal force. But time had taught him the value of restraint. Now, he understood the power of quiet strength, the kind that didn't demand attention but commanded respect. In the galley, Melissa pulled the curtain closed and turned to Sarah. What happened, Sarah? And don't give me some half-baked excuse. I need the truth. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. I didn't mean for it to escalate. He was being uncooperative, and I might have. Her voice trailed off as she struggled to find the words. Might have what? Melissa pressed, crossing her arms. I pushed him. Sarah admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't intentional, but... Sarah. Melissa's voice was sharp, but she quickly lowered it, mindful of the passengers nearby. Do you realize how serious this is? You put your hands on a passenger. That's not just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. I know, okay. I know I screwed up. Sarah snapped, her frustration boiling over. But he's just some old man trying to make trouble. He said something about 7 minutes, like he's going to do something. Melissa frowned, her concern deepening. 7 minutes? What does that mean? I don't know, Sarah admitted, running a hand through her hair. But he's not who he seems. There's something off about him. Melissa sighed, her patience wearing thin. Off? Or are you making assumptions again? You need to be careful, Sarah. You've already crossed a line, and if this escalates, it's on you. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere grew more charged with each passing minute. The passengers in first class exchanged whispers, their curiosity mingled with a growing sense of unease. Some had begun to speculate about who James really was. His calm demeanor, his cryptic words, everything about him suggested he was more than an ordinary traveler. A young woman sitting a few rows ahead turned to her companion. What if he's some kind of VIP, like a government official or something? Or a celebrity, her friend replied, glancing over at James. You never know. The murmurs reached James's ears, but he paid them no mind. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. Flipping through its pages, he stopped at a familiar passage, one he often turned to in moments of reflection. The words, penned by a long-forgotten poet, reminded him of the importance of grace under pressure. The 7 minutes James had mentioned were nearly up when the captain emerged from the cockpit. He walked down the aisle with purpose, his expression a mix of authority and concern. Stopping at James's seat, he crouched slightly to speak at eye level. Mr. Cole, I'm Captain Harris. I understand there's been an issue, he said, his tone respectful. James closed his notebook and looked up. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me, Captain. I assure you, I don't wish to cause any trouble, but I believe one of your crew members needs to be reminded of the values this airline stands for. Captain Harris nodded, glancing briefly at Sarah, who had just stepped out of the galley. Her face was pale, her earlier confidence replaced by dread. I'll address the matter personally, he assured James. James smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. I appreciate that, Captain, but there's something else you should know. What's that? Captain Harris asked, his curiosity piqued. James leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to keep the conversation private. I suspect that by now, someone on this flight has looked me up. If they haven't, they will soon. And when they do, I imagine this situation will take on a rather different tone. The captain blinked, taken aback by James' words. I see, he said slowly. Is there anything else I can do for you in the meantime? James shook his head. Not at the moment. Thank you for your time, Captain. As Captain Harris stood and walked back toward the cockpit, the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. James' cryptic remark left everyone on edge, their imaginations running wild. Who was this man, And what would happen next? The mystery hung in the air, unanswered, as the clock ticked toward an inevitable revelation. The flight continued at cruising altitude, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was anything but smooth. James remained seated, his calm and quiet demeanor an anchor in the midst of growing chaos. Sarah, on the other hand, could feel every passing second like the ticking of a bomb. Her mind raced with scenarios, each more troubling than the last. She glanced at the other passengers who were no longer pretending not to watch her. Their stares were sharp, and their murmurs felt like daggers. She was unraveling, and she knew it. In the galley, Melissa returned to Sarah, her expression stern but concerned. "The captain just spoke with him," Melissa said softly, leaning closer to avoid being overheard. "He's not happy, Sarah, and frankly, I can't blame him." "What were you thinking?" Sarah's response was defensive, her voice a harsh whisper. "I wasn't thinking, okay. I just reacted. He was being." She stopped herself, realizing that any justification she gave would sound hollow. Instead, she shook her head and looked away. "It's done now. I can't take it back." Melissa sighed, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You can't change what happened, but you need to handle the rest of this flight with professionalism. No more mistakes." Sarah nodded reluctantly, but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. As Melissa walked away, Sarah grabbed her phone from a side pocket, her fingers trembling. She quickly searched the name James Cole online, unsure of what she'd find but desperate for answers. Her breath hitched as the results loaded. Article after article appeared, accompanied by photos of James at galas, boardrooms, and charity events. Billionaire James Cole, the headlines read, philanthropist, entrepreneur, and one of the most influential Black businessmen in the country. Sarah's heart sank. Her mouth went dry as she stared at the screen. It couldn't be real. This quiet, unassuming man in seat 2A, he wasn't just a passenger. He was a titan. Her mind reeled as she scrolled through the headlines. Stories of his business empire, his work advocating for racial equality, and his massive charitable contributions filled the screen. This wasn't just a wealthy man. This was a man with power, respect, and influence. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had not only humiliated herself, but had also likely jeopardized her career. If James chose to speak out about her behavior, it wouldn't just be a slap on the wrist. It could be the end of everything she worked for. She stuffed the phone back into her pocket, her pulse racing. The walls of the plane seemed to close in around her. Meanwhile, in first class, the passengers were abuzz with speculation. The middle-aged man who had been recording earlier was now typing furiously on his phone, his excitement barely contained. "You're not going to believe this," he whispered to the woman sitting next to him. "That guy? He's James Cole, the billionaire." "No way," the woman replied, her eyes widening. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. I just looked him up. He's a huge deal. If this goes public, it's going to blow up." The whispers spread like wildfire. Each passenger had their own interpretation of the events. But one thing was clear. James Cole was no ordinary man, and Sarah's behavior was now under a magnifying glass. James, for his part, seemed unfazed by the commotion around him. He sipped his water and leaned back in his seat, his expression serene. But inside, his mind was anything but still. He'd spent decades navigating rooms filled with doubt, condescension, and outright hostility. He knew how to read a room, and this one was teetering on the edge of chaos. As the minutes passed, James decided it was time to shift the narrative. He leaned over to the passenger beside him, a young woman with a notebook open on her lap. She had been watching him cautiously, her curiosity tempered with politeness. "Excuse me," James said, his voice soft but firm. "May I borrow a pen?" The woman blinked, startled, but quickly handed him her pen. "Of course," she said. James nodded his thanks and opened his notebook, flipping to a blank page. He began to write, his pen gliding smoothly across the paper. The act of writing was deliberate, almost meditative. Each stroke carried a weight of intention. The young woman couldn't help but glance at the page, wondering what he was crafting so intently. In the galley, Sarah remained rooted in place, her mind swirling with worst-case scenarios. Melissa returned, her expression a mix of frustration and pity. "You need to apologize," she said bluntly. "Now." Sarah stiffened. "What good will that do? He's probably already made up his mind about me." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "That's not the point. You made a mistake, and you need to own up to it. If you don't, things are only going to get worse." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded. She smoothed her uniform and took a deep breath, her steps shaky as she made her way back to James' seat. When she arrived, James was still writing, his attention fully absorbed. She hesitated, unsure of how to interrupt. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, her voice barely audible. James didn't look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was writing, then capped the pen and set it down. Slowly, he turned his gaze to Sarah, his expression calm but unreadable. "Yes," he said. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Sarah began, her voice trembling. "I didn't handle things the way I should have. I was rude, and I overstepped. It wasn't right, and I'm truly sorry." James studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. He could see the fear and regret etched into her face, and he took a long pause before responding. "Thank you for apologizing," he said finally. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Sarah nodded, relief washing over her, though her shoulders remained tense. "If there's anything I can do to make this right." "There is," James interrupted gently. "You can take this moment as a lesson. Treat every person you encounter with dignity, regardless of what you think you know about them. That's how we grow." His words landed heavily, the weight of their truth sinking deep into Sarah's chest. She nodded again, this time more earnestly, and stepped away, her mind racing with the implications of what he had said. As Sarah returned to the galley, James placed the pen and notebook aside and leaned back in his seat. He knew the conflict wasn't over, far from it. But in that moment, he felt a small shift, as if a single thread in the tangled web had begun to loosen. The flight continued, the mystery surrounding James Cole only deepening as the plane edged closer to its destination. As the flight wore on, the air in the cabin felt charged with anticipation, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Passengers were now glued to their seats, the earlier hum of conversation reduced to sporadic whispers as everyone speculated about James Cole. Those who had Googled him were exchanging hurried glances, their disbelief palpable. Even those who hadn't searched his name could sense that something unusual was unfolding. The unease spread through the plane like ripples in water, each wave stronger than the last. James sat in his seat, the picture of composure. But behind his calm exterior, his mind was at work. He understood the power of perception and how quickly it could shift. He could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, their curiosity pressing in on him. He was used to scrutiny, though not usually in such an enclosed space. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to show any signs of discomfort. Sarah stayed hidden in the galley, clutching a glass of water as if it were an anchor. The gravity of her earlier actions was fully sinking in now. She knew she had crossed a line, but what haunted her most was the realization of who James really was, not just a billionaire, but a man whose influence could shape industries, policies, and reputations. Her apology, though sincere, hadn't erased her guilt. She kept replaying the moment she lost control, each detail sharper and more damning than the last. Melissa, ever the voice of reason, approached her colleague again. "Sarah," she said quietly, "you need to prepare yourself. He hasn't said much, but don't mistake his silence for forgiveness. A man like him, he doesn't have to raise his voice to make a statement." Sarah swallowed hard, her hands gripping the counter for support. "Do you think he's going to report me? File a complaint? Or worse?" Melissa sighed, her expression unreadable. "I don't know. But I do know that you've made an impression, and not the kind you'd want. For now, focus on doing your job and staying professional." In the first-class cabin, the captain made another brief appearance, his expression neutral but his movements deliberate. He stopped by James's seat, leaning slightly to speak with him. The exchange was hushed, their voices too low for anyone else to hear, but the body language told its own story. James remained calm, nodding occasionally, while the captain appeared slightly unsettled. When their conversation ended, the captain stood upright and offered a polite smile before retreating to the cockpit. The interaction only fueled the passengers' curiosity. Speculation buzzed through the cabin like static electricity, each theory more elaborate than the last. "Do you think he's going to sue the airline?" one passenger whispered to another. "Or maybe he's planning something bigger," another replied, their tone tinged with intrigue. "You don't get to where he is without knowing how to make an impact." As the plane began its slow descent toward its destination, the tension reached a fever pitch. The city lights glittered below like scattered jewels, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside the cabin. Sarah emerged from the galley, her face pale but determined. She knew she couldn't avoid James forever, and the landing would bring everything to a head. The passengers, the crew, even the captain, all of them seemed to orbit around James now, waiting to see what he would do. James, meanwhile, was quietly observing everything. He noticed the nervous glances Sarah sent his way, the whispers among the passengers, and the subtle shifts in the crew's behavior. He let it all wash over him, choosing not to act. Yet, timing was everything, and James had learned to wait for the right moment. The final moments of the flight were a study in contrasts. Outside, the plane's landing gear descended smoothly, and the runway loomed closer. Inside, the tension was almost unbearable. Melissa passed through the cabin one last time, her professional smile firmly in place, though her eyes betrayed her concern. Sarah lingered near the galley, her steps hesitant as she pretended to check supplies. The other passengers remained riveted, their attention split between James and Sarah, waiting for the inevitable. As the wheels touched down with a soft thud, a collective breath seemed to be released. But the tension didn't dissipate, it only sharpened. The plane taxied to the gate, the hum of the engines a backdrop to the charged silence inside. The passengers stayed in their seats, unusually still, as if sensing that the real drama was yet to unfold. When the seatbelt sign blinked off, James rose gracefully, his movements unhurried. He reached for his carry-on, his calm demeanor unchanged. The passengers watched with bated breath as he stepped into the aisle, his tall figure commanding attention without effort. Sarah stood frozen near the galley, her hands clutching the counter as if it could shield her from what was coming. James paused briefly, his gaze sweeping the cabin. For a moment, it felt as though he might say something, break the silence that had gripped everyone for hours. But instead, he adjusted his jacket, gave a small, enigmatic smile, and began walking toward the exit. Melissa, standing near the front, caught his eye and nodded respectfully. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something deeper, admiration, perhaps, or relief. James nodded in return, his expression unreadable. He paused briefly at the threshold, his gaze flickering back towards Sarah. She flinched slightly, expecting a reprimand, but James said nothing. Instead, he held her gaze for a moment longer, his eyes conveying a message she couldn't quite decipher, before stepping off the plane and into the terminal. As the passengers began to gather their belongings and disembark, the cabin buzzed with renewed energy. The whispers grew louder, speculation and analysis filling the air. Sarah remained rooted in place, her mind spinning with questions. What had James meant with that look? Was it forgiveness, a warning, or something else entirely? The mystery hung thick in the air, unanswered, as the crew prepared for the next leg of their journey. Outside, the world awaited James Cole, but inside, the echoes of his presence lingered, leaving everyone to wonder what ripple effects this flight would leave behind. As the last of the passengers trickled out of the cabin, Sarah felt an unbearable weight pressing down on her chest. She watched the empty aisle with a hollow expression, her mind replaying the silent look James had given her before he left. It wasn't anger. No, it was something far more unnerving. There was a calm intensity in his eyes, a quiet understanding that felt more damning than any outburst ever could. It left her feeling exposed, as if he had seen through every layer she carefully built around herself. Melissa approached her, raking the silence. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low but laced with concern. Sarah gave a stiff nod, but Melissa wasn't convinced. "Look, it's not over," she continued. "You know that, right? A man like James Cole doesn't just let something like this slide. Whatever he's planning, it's going to be calculated." Sarah let out a shaky breath. "I know," she whispered. But what can I do? I already apologized. I can't undo what happened. Melissa gave her a sympathetic look but didn't offer any answers. Instead, she walked off to join the other crew members, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. As the crew began preparing the plane for its next flight, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling slightly, and stared at the screen. It was a message from a colleague who worked in the airline's corporate office. The subject line alone sent her heart plummeting. Asterisk, asterisk, incident report inquiry. Urgent, asterisk, asterisk. Her breath caught as she opened the message. The email was brief but chilling. It stated that a formal report had been submitted by a passenger on her flight. Anonymous, but detailed. The message urged her to prepare for a follow-up meeting with airline management to discuss the incident. Sarah felt her knees weaken as she read the words again, each line driving home the reality she had been dreading. What she didn't know was that the report wasn't the only fallout from the flight. In the terminal, James was being greeted by a small team of business associates who had been waiting for him. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla, immediately picked up on his unusually reserved demeanor. "Everything okay, Mr. Cole?" Carla asked as they began walking through the bustling terminal. James gave a small smile, his expression unreadable. "It was an eventful flight," he replied. Carla raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. She knew better than to pry when James was in one of his reflective moods. Instead, she followed him as they made their way to a private lounge. What neither James nor Sarah could anticipate was the unexpected ripple effect that had already begun. Unbeknownst to Sarah, the passenger who had recorded the incident earlier in the flight had uploaded the video to social media shortly after landing. Within minutes, the clip began to gain traction. The caption read, asterisk, asterisk, flight attendant loses cool with elderly passenger. Then learns he's a billionaire. Asterisk, asterisk. The video spread like wildfire. By the time James settled into the lounge, his phone buzzed with notifications from colleagues, friends, and even a few journalists who had caught wind of the story. He glanced at the screen, his face remaining impassive as he watched the video. It captured the altercation in vivid detail, including the moment Sarah had slapped his hand away. The video ended with James's calm response, which contrasted sharply with Sarah's outburst. Carla, sitting across from him, noticed the flicker of something, amusement, resolve, cross his face. "Should I be worried?" she asked, nodding toward his phone. James set the device down and looked at her thoughtfully. "No," he said slowly, "but I think this is an opportunity." Carla tilted her head, intrigued. "For what?" James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He wasn't one to hold grudges, but he also believed in accountability. The incident on the flight was more than just a personal slight. It was a symptom of a much larger issue. He had spent years advocating for change, for a world where dignity and respect were afforded to everyone, regardless of their background or appearance. This could be a chance to shed light on that message in a way no boardroom or speech ever could. Back on the plane, Sarah's nerves were fraying. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to implode. The email, the passenger's stares, and the haunting silence from James. It was all too much. She wanted to believe that the worst was over, but deep down she knew better. As she exited the plane with the rest of the crew, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from a friend. The text read, asterisk, asterisk, is this you? Asterisk, asterisk, attached was a link to the viral video. Sarah's stomach dropped as she opened it, her hands trembling. She watched in horror as the events of the flight played out on screen, every mistake she had made now immortalized for the world to see. The comments below the video ranged from outrage to disbelief, with many calling for her immediate termination. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the reactions, each one more damning than the last. She wanted to scream, to disappear, to wake up and realize it had all been a bad dream. But this was no dream. It was her reality, and it was spiraling out of control. Elsewhere in the airport, James stood by a window overlooking the runway, his hands clasped behind his back. Carla approached him cautiously. "The video's everywhere now," she said. "You're going to be bombarded with questions." James nodded, his gaze steady. "Let them ask," he said calmly. "I already know how I'm going to respond." As Carla watched him, she realized something she had always admired about James. He never acted impulsively. Every move he made was deliberate, every word carefully chosen. Whatever he had planned, it wasn't going to be small. And while Sarah tried to piece together how she would salvage her career, James was quietly preparing to use this moment to make a statement that no one, least of all Sarah, would see coming. As Sarah walked through the terminal, her eyes darted around, half expecting cameras or reporters to ambush her at any moment. The video's virality weighed heavily on her, and each notification that pinged her phone made her stomach churn. She had spent the last hour drafting an email to her supervisor, hoping to preemptively address the situation, but no words seemed sufficient to explain what had happened, let alone justify it. Meanwhile, James was in a private conference room at the airport, seated at the head of a table surrounded by his team. A large screen displayed a stream of news articles and social media posts about the incident. Despite the whirlwind of attention, James remained calm, his expression thoughtful. The room buzzed with suggestions from his advisors, each presenting a strategy to handle the situation, but James raised a hand, silencing the chatter. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady. "This is about something bigger, how we treat each other, the assumptions we make, and the power of accountability. I don't want this to be a story about revenge. I want it to be a lesson." The team exchanged uncertain glances. Carla, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "What do you have in mind?" she asked. James's lips curved into a faint smile. "Something impactful, something they'll remember long after the headlines fade." That evening, Sarah sat in her tiny apartment, scrolling through the endless comments on the video. Her name was trending, and not in a good way. Some were calling for her termination, while others speculated about her motives. A small fraction defended her, citing the stress flight attendants face daily, but the overwhelming consensus was clear. She had crossed a line. Tears blurred her vision as she thought about everything she had worked for slipping away. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was an official email from her airline, summoning her to a meeting the following morning. Across town, James was finalizing his plan. He had contacted the airline's CEO directly, bypassing the usual channels, and proposed an unconventional approach to resolving the situation. The CEO, initially hesitant, eventually agreed, swayed by James' calm reasoning and reputation for fairness. The details were kept tightly under wraps, but James ensured everything would be in place by the next day.